drugs and alcohol. We are also addicted to isidingo, isn't it? We are also addicted to some other things. We are addicted to samba chips. We are addicted to many things. It's just that we don't have to get treatment for that. But it's an addiction. But I want to stress to you this evening that addiction, there are good addictions and bad addictions. If somebody goes to the gym every day to go and exercise, what kind of addiction do you think that is? Is that a good addiction? What about learning? What about wanting to always study? Do you think that's a good addiction? Do you need therapy for that? Is my mic off? Oh, okay. Hey, but my voice must be very loud, eh? Can you hear me now? So there are different kinds of addiction. But look, the addictions that I've just mentioned to you now do not damage the brain, does it? Does jamming damage the brain, or it actually enhances it to be more active? And so is learning, is that correct? Learning also does that. But tonight we're going to talk about severe consequences of addiction of drugs and alcohol. So when I mention addiction, just know that I'm mentioning all types of drug or substance abuse addiction, all right? We are not really touching a lot on gambling, but there's another addiction altogether. Who goes to the casino every day here? Anyone goes to the casino to go and gamble? Only one person. So we must talk. We need to talk. All right? Okay. But I'm not going to touch that one today. Is it okay? All right. So what is the science of addiction? Addiction is a science. Addiction is, if I were to give it a description, said, okay, let me start with a verse first. John 10 verses 10. And I've taken it from the, the Amplified Version. It says, the thief has come only in order to what? To steal and destroy, kill and destroy. And what does Jesus say? The enemy has come to kill, steal, and destroy. But Jesus says that I have come to do what? To give life in abundance. And so that you can have full life and overload with life. So it means that even though the enemy comes to kill and destroy with drugs and alcohol and addiction, there is also an opportunity and a resolve for that to have life when Jesus comes into the equation. So addiction obviously involves a multiple of factors. As you can see there, you'll find that obviously there's the drug there in the center, the yellow, and then what is the other one there? It's environment, right? Biological, or do you know that if somebody uses drugs and alcohol and there's a genetic problem of mental health in that family, you'll find that the person who uses drugs also become, raak mal in hulle koppe en dan moet hulle nou mal hospitaal toe gaan. Because it is in the family, because that person started using drugs or alcohol. So there's a genetic trace as far as that is concerned. Obviously then there's also the brain, and then there's also obviously the addiction there. So we find that there's a multiple factors that causes people to, as far as that involves addiction. Now, the brain is a communication portal, right? The brain is there, in the brain obviously we've got what you call nerve cells. And nerve cells, there's an electrifying or the neurons in the brain is electrified so that there can be communication. Just like a network. When you pick up your cell phone, there must be a network, right? So similar into the brain, there's a network that is charged so that your brain can communicate and the neurons can communicate with each other. You find, okay, this is the brain, and as you can see, all that there, that animation, is actually how active the brain is. Now, the brain works like this. Here am I'm standing here, right? You can hear me talk, right? Or I'm not word, isn't it? So I must speak so that you can hear me. You may want to respond if I ask you to respond, right? So this is how the neurons work in the brain. There's what you call a sending neuron and then a receiving neuron. The sending neuron sends a message into the to the receiving neuron, and that is how we communicate. Okay? So when we use drugs or alcohol, the dopamine levels, remember what I spoke about dopamine last night, that dopamine is our pleasure chemicals. But when you use the drugs, the dopamine dries up. And what happens, then we find that the dopamine levels are very, very low. And I'm going to tell you about what happens when the dopamines are low. So why do people use drugs? For many reasons. There are some of the reasons that people use drugs. But I want to also mention to you, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but I want to mention to you that with our children, you find that you've heard about peer pressure, yes? But did you know that peer pressure is not something that is as prevalent as it used to be? I'm not saying there's no peer pressure, but you find that there's less peer pressure because children, especially the youth, want to relate with one another. And when you want to relate with your friend, maybe you're listening to the same type of music, maybe you like the same kind of clothes, and there are certain commonalities between the two, between you and your friends that you don't want to feel left out. So you relate to one another, and when you relate to one another, you also have things in common, and then you start using drugs because everybody else is using drugs. Nobody has given you any peer pressure. You see? So social pressure can be one of them. But do you know that there are people that are normally waking up, especially those that are using CAT. They wake up in the morning to go to work so that they can go perform well at work. Less stress, they perform well at work because the drug is actually stimulating the brain cells to work faster. In Westbury, I've seen this. In the morning, cars, like going to the McDonald's, cars drive up and the drug sellers at a certain corner, they just give them the package, they give them the money, they go. Give them the package, give them the money, go. That's what's happening in our communities today. People that are on their way to work. So how do drugs damage the brain? So drugs can mimic a block of neurotransmitters. Remember I was talking about the neurotransmitters. And it affects the mood, perception, and overall brain function. In fact, when people are using drugs for a long time, their entire mood, it restructures the brain, soos eiers in a pan. It fries the brain. And you find that your brain cannot function very well. And I don't want to go too much onto the slides, but I want to explain certain things to you. Did you know that especially when you are on crystal meth, which is Turk, that it affects the emotional centers of the brain, where your emotions are. That's why when I counsel, people that are on drugs, their emotions run very high. They lose their temper now. Maak jou nou, ek gaan jou nou seermaak. Have you experienced that?
Amen.
Because they cannot control their emotions. It damages the control centers of the brain. And that is why never argue with someone who is drunk from alcohol, never argue with someone who is high on drugs. You are going to waste your time. In fact, you're putting your life in danger. Keep quiet and walk away. Because they cannot control themselves. And so let's talk about neurotoxicity. Neurotoxicity means that the brain is inflamed. When you use the chemicals on the brain, toxifies the brain cells. And what happens then is that because of the inflammation that's on the brain, the neurons of the brain, they then become temporarily suffer from a mental health condition. You know, like what? Like schizophrenia. I treat people with drug-related schizophrenia and paranoia disorder. Sociopaths, hulle is numb, hulle kan niks, they don't have any feeling for anything. That is why they can take your stuff, they can do things and have no worries about it. It is because the senses are numb. Remember the verse, the enemy have come to do what? To kill the brain cells, to steal the joy. Because when you are on dopamine gives you a high. You know, when you have eaten food, you feel satisfied that, wow, that was a lekker biryani. Or that was a very nice drink that I have. Or maybe I went to a restaurant and I was with my husband or my wife or my girlfriend and we had such a nice romantic time. It gives you joy. People that are on drugs don't have that joy. It's finished. You know, one girl, in fact, it was outside here, somebody brought her to me one time when we were at church. She says to me, you know, Uncle Wilson, I really love my children. Mooi meisie, beautiful child. She said, but when I want my drugs, I don't care about my children, what they're going to eat. I want the drug. That is what addiction does. So what else that it does? It also, your short-term and long-term memory gone. You would send him to the shop or her to the shop. I remember this one time, I went to a house and I went to counsel a couple, you know. And somehow, somebody called the wife and said, hey, iemand roep jou gou hier buitekant. So as she went, almost done, as she went out, she discussed it and said, hey man, kom ons gaan nou gou winkel toe. Ek is besig met 'n counseling hierso. But she left because she forgot there's a counseling session in the house. So it changes the brain structure. All right? It changes the brain structure in such a way that everything, even your movement, the way you move, changes altogether. And then the one sad thing is that you don't care about the consequences, about what you do. Our young children become pregnant from an old opa with grys baard because she only wanted this fix, and then he impregnated her because she wanted the money, because she's a young, beautiful young woman and who is supposed to have dignity, but her dignity has left, and she sells herself for 50 rand so that she can go and get a fix. They don't care about the consequences of their lives. So the lack of dopamine, this is where the drug abuse comes in. When there's no dopamine in the brain, you become totally lifeless. The only thing that is in your brain is, how am I going to get the next fix? That is why there's crime. That is why they steal. Aunties complain by my sê, hy het my hele AMC potte gevat. He took the TV. Because they don't care about what the consequences of their actions are, because the drug has taken over the brain. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about solutions. We're going to talk about how we can combat this thing through counseling, training, and what the community, and over the week as we go, the community, how we can bring in the community to combat this war on drugs. Thank you.